Hello, everyone. It's my very great pleasure to introduce and welcome Fadhli Lukman today, who is going to talk about Kitab Malay, Quran translation, and the politics of the national language, a very fascinating topic. Fadhli is a faculty member at the State Islamic University Sunan Kalijaga in Yogyakarta in Indonesia, and also a postdoctoral fellow at the ERC project Textual Microcosms at Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He received his BA and MA degrees from State Islamic University Sunan Kalijaga in Yogyakarta and his PhD from the University of Freiburg. And his work focuses on Quran translations and Quranic commentaries, especially in Indonesia. I highly recommend you consult his book, which is the first real monograph-length authoritative study of the official Quran translation of the Indonesian government, Al-Quran dan Terjemahnya, which was published in 2022 and is available in open access. But without further ado, Fadhli, we're looking forward to your talk, and please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Johanna, and thank you, first of all, for inviting me to join and to talk in this global conversation, global Quran conversation. And thanks also for the audience who join us in this talk. Let me share my screen. Okay. The title of my presentation is Kitab Malay, Quran Translation and the Politics of the National Language. This presentation is a further development of my dissertation I wrote in Freiburg University under the supervision of Johanna. And the dissertation is published as the first title of the Global Quran book series under the title The Official Indonesian Quran Translation, The History and Politics of Al-Quran dan Terjemahannya. I would like to begin my presentation with the abstract that I sent to Johanna a few months ago before this global conversation begins, as follows. In the 17th century, Abdul Rauf Asingkili composed the first full Quran commentary in Malay. This commentary, strongly influenced by a literal technique of translation, resulted in a specific register of Malay called Kitab Malay, which its contemporary readers had enough greater headache trying to understand, and thus is considered by scholars as an atrocious Malay. After 3 centuries, the Republic of Indonesia proudly introduced Al-Quran dan Terjemahannya as the official Indonesian Quran translation. The aims of this translation include establishing formal and contemporary Indonesian as the language of Islamic scholarship. My study will explore the historical evolution of the Malay religious register, tracing its transformation from an unfavorable atrocious Kitab Malay to an official language register, and examine the role of Quran translation in this journey. The region we are concerned in this presentation is Indonesia, an archipelago stretching from the island of Sumatra in the west to a part of Papua in the east. This territory is not always called Indonesia. In 1945, and Indonesia is a name that carries connotations of independence and anti-colonialism. During the colonial period, the region had another name, the Netherlands Indies or the Netherlands East Indies. The name Indonesia became popular from the beginning of the 20th century as the political expression, and of course became official with the independence in August 1945. However, going back further to the 16th, 19th centuries, and specifically relevant to our current theme, the region now called Indonesia was part of what is referred to as Jawi. Therefore, we will refer to this regional name throughout this presentation in accordance with their historical significance. Indonesian archipelago features great linguistic and ethnic variety. The area offers almost 600 different languages. For maybe a millennium, the Malay language has been the lingua franca, allowing inter-ethnic trade and official government correspondence. In the modern form, Malay in Indonesia is recognized as the Indonesian language, Bahasa Indonesia. In the 20th century, Malay became the dominant language of the nationalist movement and soon enough found itself as one of the 2 languages put forward to become the unifying language of a future independent state during the first Youth Congress held in 1926. During the second Youth Congress in 1928, Malay was officially recognized as new Bahasa Indonesia and became the unifying language with the issuance of the Youth Pledge, Sumpah Pemuda. The pledge promised, among other things, to uphold the language of unity, the Indonesian language, menjunjung bahasa persatuan bahasa Indonesia. The Youth Pledge was a starting point for a move to implement the new official Indonesian language across the country. However, Dutch continued to play a critical role as the language of administration and was the language of choice for the upper class population until the occupation of the Dutch Indies by the Japanese in 1942, which effectively reduced the influence of Dutch in the region. The Indonesian Declaration of Independence in 1945 then established the cultivation of Indonesian as the national language as one of the central projects of the state. Indonesian has since become the primary language in the literary culture of Indonesia. It is employed at official government events and in the mass media, in education, and in official publications. The consolidation of Indonesian as the national language is also connected with the decline of Jawi script. Jawi is an adaptive script from Arabic following the spread of Islam in Indonesia in Southeast Asia. The early Muslim kingdoms in the archipelago supported the use of the script by employing it in education, administration, trade, and diplomacy, and it had been dominant since the 15th century. Islamic religious writings were produced in Jawi, and it continued to be hegemonic in the academic sphere for 6 centuries, as most Islamic scholars use it for scholarly purposes or for pedagogical reasons. The Dutch introduced the Roman alphabet, and the post-colonial Indonesian eventually sustained this policy. In short, the Indonesian language with the Latin script are officially used in Indonesia today. Kitab Malay. Kitab Malay is a religious variant of Malay language, primarily employed in Islamic religious writings, which are known also as Kitab Jawi. Peter Riddle suggests that this variant is based on a literal translation that is influenced by the scriptural translation paradigm, which aims to preserve the original characteristic to the greatest extent possible. As a result, Kitab Malay mostly reflects the structure of Arabic rather than Malay. This is also why some scholars consider Kitab Malay to be atrocious Malay. So this is one of the testimony from some scholars, Umar Bakri. The saddest situation concerns the language of religious texts. Only very few contain language which is correct and accurate. The language of most follow Arabic language structures. Only the vocabulary is Indonesian. The style of the language, the word order, and the grammar is little different from Arabic. It could be called Indo-Arabic. End of quote. And also Rajab, also cited from Riddle, why was the translation into Indonesian so long-winded and repetitive? Why with the vocabulary half Indonesian and half Arabic and the grammar completely Arabic? And in fact, Riddle says that in the 7th century Malay scholarly counterparts of Abdul Rauf probably had even greater headache trying to understand Abdul Rauf commentary. That's how he illustrates Kitab Malay as atrocious Malay. Riddle, however, declined to label this particular variant as poor Malay variant. He argues that such a view fails to acknowledge that the authors of Kitab Malay or Kitab Jawi, such as Abdul Rauf, the author that he investigated, were part of a lineage of translators of religious literature who were motivated by a number of very specific purposes. In order to demonstrate the structure of Malay, Riddle draws a comparison between the Malay used in Tarjuman al-Mustafid and Malay that has not been influenced by Arabic. Tarjuman al-Mustafid is a Malay translation of Tafsir al-Jalalain completed by Abdul Rauf in the 17th century. For the quote standard Malay, Riddle selected a text from Malay literary tradition that was contemporary to Tarjuman, namely Hikayat Aceh, an anonymous work that was commissioned by Sultan Iskandar Muda, the most famous ruler of the Kingdom of Aceh. Riddle comparison is very technical linguistically. He underlines the presence of various categories of inflections in Arabic verbs, including aspects, voice, mood, person, number, and gender. Malay doesn't have these inflections. I do not have enough background in linguistics, unfortunately, and cannot go into all the details in this regard. But in simple terms, we can see a pretty clear difference between these two groups of sentences. The two sentences on the left are derived from Hikayat Aceh, while the two sentences on the right are sourced from Tarjuman al-Mustafid. For the convenience of those who are not familiar with the Indonesian language, I have included English translation from Riddle. The example from Tarjuman al-Mustafid demonstrates a recurring use of mereka itu in red, which in English translates as they. The second instance of mereka itu is derived from the verbal inflection for person and number in Arabic, specifically in the Arabic word amanu. The sentence has a comparable structure to the first one on the left from Hikayat Aceh. However, in this Hikayat Aceh sentence, the phrase mereka itu doesn't appear again after the verb bertahan, to stand. In addition, a similar pattern can be observed as well in the repeated use of keduanya, which come from Arabic inflections. Should this passage from Hikayat Aceh originate in Arabic, let's say, innahum yaqifuna fi Sukamandi, and be translated into Malay, it would be like this. Sesungguhnya mereka itu bertahan, mereka itu di Sukamandi. So there is a repeated occurrence of mereka itu there. We have seen how Kitab Malay is, in the words of Riddle, translationist and derives considerable influence from Arabic, as it is rooted in the tradition of literal translation of scripture. Riddle indeed bases his argument on Tarjuman al-Mustafid, a translation of the Quran commentary, and occasionally makes comparison with the manuscript of Al-Kahfi, the first extended tafsir that predates Tarjuman il-Malay. However, the first work with Kitab Malay is not a translation of scripture or its derivative texts, such as Tarjuman. A century earlier, there was a Malay interlinear translation of a theological tract entitled Aqaidun Nasafi. This work, like Tarjuman, also used Kitab Malay. With the Malay interlinear translations of An-Nasafi displaying Kitab Malay, I would like to argue that while it is true that Kitab Malay is a product of literal translation of Arabic text, a more crucial component in its formation is the post-classical scholasticisms of Islamic intellectual history. For this argument, I drew inspiration from Ahmad Shamsi's work titled Rediscovering the Islamic Classics, How Editors and Print Culture Transform an Intellectual Tradition. In this book, Shamsi calls the period between the 16th century and the 19th century the post-classical period. During this period, as Shamsi suggests, quote, education in the various corners of Muslim world was structured around an increasingly uniform curriculum of works, or rooted in such concise teaching texts. The teaching texts were encased in multiple layers of subsequent commentary, consisting of primary commentaries, syarah, singular, glosses, hashiyah, and sometimes tertiary commentaries, takrir. These works, and especially the commentary layers, were predominantly products of the 16th to 19th century. End of quote. Thus, quote, the emergence of glosses as the key medium of scholarship is characteristic of the post-classical age. The proliferation of glosses created a specific kind of literary momentum and produced a self-contained referential universe in which earlier works were progressively sidelined and forgotten. Eventually, the older literature came to survive only in second-hand citation of individual opinions attributed to particular scholars or intellectual currents, often in oversimplified or distorted form. End of quote. Preoccupation with lexical, rhetorical, and logical features of the commented upon text was the primary intellectual mode during the post-classical period. The ideal of education was to master a text, which means to have complete comprehension of the meaning of every word and its grammatical place in the sentence. Furthermore, the substantive content and the historical context of the text is out of question. Shamsi's thesis about post-classical scholasticism mirror very much the Malay interlinear translation of Aqaid al-Nasafi. Let's look at the interlinear translation of Masbalah in the text. So we can see here that Basmalah is translated under the line and kumulai kitab ini dengan nama Allah yang maha murah yang mengasihi hambanya di akhirat in Malay. And in English, I commence this book with the name of Allah, who is the most benevolent, who has mercy upon his servant in the afterlife. And I mark two phrase read. It is to mark interpretive translation. The translation of Basmalah in this work appears to be interpretive. There are editions of kumulai kitab ini. I commence this book at the start, and hambanya di akhirat, his servants in the afterlife at the end. What is the basis for these editions? Anyone who is acquainted with the Islamic intellectual tradition will be familiar with the linguistic analysis of Basmalah. In Arabic, a sentence doesn't typically start with the particle ba, bi. Therefore, an ellipsis is present in this sentence, which, if explicitly stated, would read as Abtada'u Bismillah or Akra'u Bismillah as an example. This must be the rationale behind memulai kitab ini. In a similar vein, the Islamic intellectual tradition also explained the different meaning of Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim, two terms that appear together in different forms but are derived from one root, namely Ra-Ha-Ma. One explanation specifies Rahman as the mercy of God to all the creatures in the world, and Rahim as a more specific mercy that is bestowed on the obedient servants only in the afterlife. This explains the addition hambanya di akhirat for Ar-Rahim. This is just a very simple example, but it illustrates a phenomenon that aligns with Shamsi's theory on the post-classical intellectual paradigm. The translation of one sentence from Aqaidun Nasafi exemplifies how the translator was very concerned with the meaning and grammatical features of each word. Furthermore, the explanation given for the words was taken from earlier literature and appears only as a snippet of quotation, or, to use Ashamsi's words, second-hand citation of individual opinions attributed to particular scholars or intellectual currents, often in oversimplified or distorted form. A more extensive observation of manuscript with interlinear translations, which I and the team are currently doing under Professor Rich's supervision in the Textual Microcosms project, may reveal many more complex and intricate examples. But in short, it is possible to suggest that the translation of Aqaidun Nasafi showcases the meeting of the post-classical scholasticisms of Islamic intellectual tradition with the non-Arabic Islamic tradition. This encounter has resulted in works of interlinear translations, while Syarah, Hasyah, and Takrir were the main product in the Arabic context. In non-Arabic one, it was interlinear translation. And more specifically, for our current concern, the encounter between post-classical scholasticisms and non-Arabic tradition became an important sediment that shaped Kitab Malay as a religious variant of the Malay language. Earlier at the beginning of this presentation, I briefly mentioned the history of Indonesian language, highlighting how the Malay language was infused with political aspirations as a unifying language against the colonizers, and subsequently become the official language of the country. I have also discussed the Dutch government's introduction of the Latin script and the subsequent continuation of this policy by the post-colonial Indonesian government and how it affected the decline of Jawi scholarship. Let us revisit this subject, reflecting how it relates to the post-classical scholasticisms that was just explained, with an additional consideration of another concept, the new centrality of the Quranic message underlined by Johanna in her book Muslim Quranic Interpretation Today. It is important to note that the period of the initiation of national language politics by the independence political movement and the widespread use of Latin script after its introduction and used by the Dutch government as the language of administration and education coexisted with the modern phenomenon that marked the new centrality of the Quranic message. The Quran is indeed the central text in Islamic civilization throughout history. However, Muslims' daily encounters with the Quran are arguably limited to key ritual aspects such as prayer or regular recitation of the Quran. There are a number of other layers beneath the sacred text that play a role in shaping Muslim religious traditions, cognitions, and practices. Layers that manifest in Islamic disciplines such as theology and especially law. These layers evolve with post-classic intellectual model described earlier. Nevertheless, the concept of placing the Quran at the core of all facets of Muslim life has emerged in the modern era. This concept is also frequently referred to as the paradigm of returning to the Quran and Sunnah. In Ashamsi's study, this period corresponds to the print revolution, where a number of key actors sought to break the layers of commentaries and revive the major works of the classical period. In the context of Johanna Pink's study, the emergence of Quranic translation into world languages is a manifestation of the Quranic's new centrality. These four axes, print culture and the needs of post-classical scholasticism, the new centrality of the Quranic message, and the politics of national language and the decline of Jawi scholarship, are interconnected in the new chapter of Malay in the 20th century. Dutch language politics gave rise to the new group of intellectuals in the Indonesian Muslim demographic. They learned Dutch and were comfortable using the Latin script. As Muslim, they found that they had insufficient knowledge of the Quran and Islam. However, they were uncomfortable with Kitab Malay, and when discussing or writing about Islam, they did not rely on Kitab Malay. For some, even European or Ahmadiyya writings on Prophet Muhammad or the Quran are more comfortable. It was to be expected at this point. Several scholars undertook the task of translating the Quran into the Indonesian language, keeping in mind the interests and sensibilities of the emerging intellectual community. The result is a model of direct engagement with Quranic meaning through modern translation products that no longer reflect the tradition of post-classical scholasticism. That is why there has been such a significant growth of Quranic translation and short tafsirs in the 20th century in Indonesia. Furthermore, this development resulted into the existence of two language models that are dedicated to the Islamic intellectual tradition, have existed since this time. Numerous traditional scholastic groups continue to adhere to the post-classical intellectual pattern. Despite adopting printed edition of books, they maintain the traditional approach to translating Arabic texts. Today, the method is commonly referred to as the Sebermula method in Sumatra, named after one of the Arabic grammatical markers in Malay that is utilized in this approach. This approach is comparable to makna gandul or in Javanese tradition. This is the first model. The second model represents a modern group that prefers to use the more natural Malay or Indonesian language. Nevertheless, the trajectory of Indonesia's development after gaining independence leans toward prioritizing modern schools with Indonesian language and Latin script. Education in traditional institutions such as pesantren, surau Odaya, etc., has experienced a gradual decline in prominence. Consequently, there has been a decline in the number of Indonesian Muslims who employ Kitab Malay as the language of instruction in the Islamic education, while the number of standard Indonesian users has been increasing. And then there is the official Quran translation of the state. In 1965, Indonesia introduced the official state translation of the Quran for the first time. From the beginning, the translation occurred through bureaucratic processes, from a parliamentary mandate to the president, an assignment by the president to the Minister of Religion, the formation of the committee by the Minister of Religion, the work of the translation by the committee, and then the inauguration of the translation once they completed on the anniversary of Indonesian independence. As the official Quran translation of the state, it reflects the diverse interests and policies of the state. And what is relevant in the context of the current presentation is that this product is a state effort to make modern Indonesian the language of Islamic scholarship. Let's see one of the forwards of the first edition of this translation from the vice chairman of the parliament, Irham Khalid. Do not think that the existence of the translation of the Quran in Indonesian language will only help those who do not comprehend the Arabic language alone, so that they can understand the content of this holy scripture. It will also benefit those who understand Arabic, referring to the traditional scholastic communities, but have not familiarized with the well and beautifully structured Bahasa Indonesia. This statement conveys a number of significant points. First, Al-Quran dan terjemahannya was intended to provide those Indonesian Muslims with no competence in Arabic and Islamic intellectual tradition with an accessible interpretation of the Quran. They are the modern growing intellectual. Secondly, this forward contributed to a nationalist ideology, given that since the youth pledge in the 1928, language was viewed as one of the primary means by which to reinforce nationalism. Thirdly, and most importantly in this context, the translation of the Quran into the Indonesian language was intended to unify Muslims through the use of one language, the official language of the state, written with Roman script. While the reformists and the new intellectuals were already long accustomed to Indonesian and the Latin script, this new system was strange for the traditionalists. As the quote cited from Irham Khalid's foreword to Al-Quran dan Terjemah pointed out, the translation was also intended to benefit those who were familiar with the Arabic language, but not with well and beautifully structured Bahasa Indonesia. To further this end, Sukarno, the first president of Indonesia, established state-run Islamic higher education institutions as centers of Muslim scholarship, operating in Indonesian, and dictated that they must produce religious literatures in the official language. Through both Al-Quran dan terjemahannya and Islamic higher education institutions, the state aimed to establish Indonesian as the language of Islamic scholarship. In addition to this, the fourth edition of Al-Quran dan terjemahannya, which was published in 2019, provides the first acknowledgement of the official involvement of the Language Cultivation and Development Agency, the department is responsible for language planning under the Ministry of Education, which supplied its own expert to contribute to the revision. The agency officials become members of the editorial team during this third revision process, with the responsibility of overseeing the translation in terms of the structure of the Indonesian language used in the target text. In other words, they play the same role they usually do in the formulation of state documents, such as the Constitution and the legislative text, which is to make sure that they are appropriately written in well-structured Indonesian with formal diction, kata baku. However, their presence was part of a reciprocal process. Not only were they supposed to improve the editorial quality of the translation, but they were also responsible for expanding the Indonesian lexicon. If they found no equivalent Indonesian term for a particular Quranic word with the potential to be widely used in daily conversation, they were asked to list the word for inclusion as the prospective part of Indonesian vocabulary. This development practically made Kitab Malay disappear. If Kitab Malay was originally a religious variant that was even called atrocious, today the language of Islamic scholarship in Indonesia is standard Indonesian. Let's conclude this presentation by comparing again the Malay language of the 17th century with the Indonesian Islamic language of today using Tarjuman al-Mustafid and Qur'an in its translations. For those who are not familiar with Indonesia, may not understand the distinct between this translation, but just see the red dot, the red marks here. In the left, there is a repeated occurrence of mereka itu, as we discussed, and keduanya, but to become a simplified language as the national language. And this is how the Kitab Malay on the left and the Indonesian official language on the right. Finally, I would like to argue that Kitab Malay is a product of the non-Arabic post-classical scholasticisms that flourished in Indonesia and Malay world, and the various modern development that killed this post-classical tradition also killed Kitab Malay. Today, Kitab Malay is only one of the oral translation methods maintained by a few educational institutions that still value the post-classical traditions. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your feedback and discussions.